Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We wanted to give folks a minute or two to log in, but as we have a lot to cover this afternoon on this important topic, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah. I'm the Director of Pro Bono and Partnerships at HIAS, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Lisa, the Director of Inclusion, Diversity, and Culture at HIAS. Lisa is a certified DEI practitioner. She creates and implements strategies that intentionally foster diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workspace. And her role at HIAS encompasses creating and implementing broad DEI strategies, designing awareness and training programs, and developing internal communications to amplify DEI. We're also joined by our colleague Rahatullah, who is our Afghan Parolee Community Coordinator for the Afghan Parole Assistance Program at HIAS. Rahatullah works to help connect HIAS refugee resettlement affiliates across the country with local and national organizations who are interested in providing support to Afghan parolees within their communities. Just a couple quick preliminary matters before we jump into the meat of today's program. First, as a reminder, CLE credit is available in California, New York, and Texas, and we expect that it'll also be available in Illinois. We'll be circulating a CLE form via email after today's training. Please follow the instructions in that form if you want to apply for a CLE credit. And keep in mind that we are going to be reading out a CLE code at the end of the presentation that you'll need to be able to get CLE credit today. So please pay attention, make sure you get that code, write it down. If you are interested in CLE credit from another jurisdiction, we'll need to check in with our provider, but I would still encourage you to write down that CLE code so that you're able to apply if appropriate. Next slide. So today's session is really designed to provide some background on concepts around culture, cultural awareness, and cultural humility. We're going to spend a bit of time discussing how to incorporate these important principles into your work more generally. And then we'll hear specifically about considerations for attorneys who are working with the Afghan parolee population. We're hoping to save time at the end of our hour for Q&A. And we're also going to do our best to address any questions that come up via the Q&A throughout the presentation. So just a reminder to use the Q&A. If you have questions, we'll try to address them either via the Q&A or live, but keep in mind that we do have a lot that we want to get through, and we have a lot of people joining today, so we might not be able to get to everybody's questions. And with that, if you want to go to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is from David Foster Wallace's This is Water, which was a commencement announcement he made in 2005. And it says, 2 young fish are swimming in the sea when they encounter an older fish. Good morning, how's the water? The older fish asks them. The 2 youngsters swim along for a little bit longer until one of them turns around and says to the other, what the hell is water? So I like starting this conversation on culture because I think this is a very useful visualization of culture. Culture is important and culture matters because it shapes our beliefs, our attitudes, our values, and how we maintain comfort with the familiar. Culture is something that's operating all around us and operating internally as well. Child development research has shown that culture is set at a very young age, between the months of 9 months and 5 years old. We are already starting to understand and grasp our cultural surroundings. So it's important to note that in many societies, especially pluralistic and diverse societies, that there's something I like to call macro culture and micro culture, meaning culture with a big C and culture with a small c. And I think this is something most people can relate to within our own homes, within our own households, and our own family dynamics. We have a certain cultural understanding, working, perhaps some family traditions and family recipes that have been passed along across generations. And that might be very different from a larger cultural framework, or macro culture, and culture with a big C. And these are different in our school cultures and our work cultures. We also understand macro cultures through media, representation, holidays that are celebrated, history that is studied. These are all ways that culture is being spread to us, and cultural systems that we're operating in. Next slide. So what is culture? Culture is the systems of knowledge shared by a group of people. It's also cultivated behavior that is the totality of a person's learned, accumulated experience, which is socially transmitted. It's important to note that culture is not static, it is dynamic, and it can change over time. Some of the elements of culture are things like religion, beliefs, attitude, hierarchies and roles, objects and possessions, but also notions of time and space. All of these are aspects of culture and have profound impact on our internal framework and how we view and understand the world. Next slide, please. So even though some of these elements may seem tangible and are visible, such as food and music and language, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the ways that culture operates and is internalized really does operate under the surface and has more complexity to it than maybe what we can implicitly see and understand. And that's around values and religious belief systems and notions of beauty, learning styles, thought processes, the way we think about raising children and how we respect our elders. All of this is part of culture. So all of these are aspects of understanding our own culture and the cultures of those around us. But I also want to note that we should also hold the diversity that happens within cultures and the intersectionality. And it's important to hold each person as an individual as well. So these aspects work and they help us understand and develop what we call cultural competency or cultural awareness, which is a skill and a frame so that we can better interact cross-culturally. But we want to be careful of using them as static categories. When we see them and we foster generalizations from them, sometimes those can lead to stereotypes. And that's what we want to be mindful of. Next slide. And this is really the importance of where cultural humility comes from. So cultural humility started in the 1990s in the healthcare field, but has since then spread across mental health and social advocacy and social justice. And cultural humility posits that it's a lifelong process of self-reflection where the individual learns about others' cultures, but first starts with an examination of their own cultural identity and belief systems. In other words, cultural humility is a mindset that we cultivate and is an ongoing process that never ends, but works in combination with some of those things from the previous slide of cultural awareness and cultural competency. Cultural humility challenges us to broaden our cultural perspectives and our frames of references. Cultural humility is the knowledge of our cultural self, the knowledge of others' cultures, and understanding that there's a knowledge beyond self and other. So it involves a humble awareness that we will never stop learning and growing as we connect with others around us. Next slide. So cultivating cultural humility in the legal space. It's essentially bringing this understanding of complex identities, that even in sameness, that there's difference, that not one person will be fully competent in another person's culture, that it's evolving and it's dynamic. And what it really requires when we're giving service to others is partnering with them and co-learning with them as they're the experts in their own life. And so a lot of that starts with, again, the awareness of ourselves and the limits of what we know and what we might not know, what we don't know. So it's remaining humble and curious to embracing the complexities of who we all are. Next slide. So what does cultural humility require? Cultural humility says to us for a moment to set aside what we think we know and to learn from the people that we're interacting with, to reserve judgment and to bridge cultural divides and perspectives. It's demonstrating active listening, reflecting, reserving judgment, and really entering their world. Next slide. So what does cultural humility look like for lawyers? Again, it requires us to be humble, to be flexible, to be dynamic, to recognize that we won't ever be completely fluent in someone else's culture, to co-create with them and to co-learn with them, to strive towards a greater sense of self-awareness and understanding of our own individual identities and beliefs, and to challenge us to be mindful of how our own cultural framework may impact how we treat and understand others. Sarah, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for that great introduction to this topic and for kind of framing this issue for us and also reminding us why this topic is so important and why we're holding this training as part of this work. Next slide. And I do see questions coming into the chat about whether the slides will be available. And yes, we will circulate the PowerPoint following the training. Next slide. Okay, so to talk a little bit more about how the introduction Lisa just provided impacts working with immigrant clients more generally. So it's important to remember that our clients are often experiencing a lot of uncertainty as they work towards stability in the United States. Our clients, and particularly this population of Afghan parolees that we're working with, are more often than not survivors of trauma. They may be low income, and they're in a brand new country that they're still figuring out how to navigate. This is really important to keep in mind because it may impact how your clients interact with you as their lawyer. Next slide. So we want to start off with a couple key points when thinking about this broader issue. First, and really importantly, there is a power structure at play in your attorney-client relationship. Your client may agree to things that you ask that they actually don't completely understand. Or your client may have concerns about disappointing you if they say yes or no to a particular strategy or a particular question. Or this power structure may show up in a number of other ways. So it's the best thing to keep in mind when thinking about how to navigate this relationship and how to work around the power structure that's naturally going to exist is to continue to think about how to best lead with empathy and respect. The best thing to keep in mind as you navigate the relationship is constantly working to bring empathy and respect into all of your interactions with the client. And again, this will really help you manage that power structure and is really the starting point for developing the relationship of trust you need with the client if you're going to best work with them and help them reach their goal, whatever that might look like for them in their legal case. Next slide. So what can you be doing to help manage this power structure that we just talked about and working to bring empathy and respect into your relationship with your client? So first, and really importantly, keep in mind that communication is likely going to be a challenge. both because you're probably going to be working with an interpreter, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation, but also because you and your client may have very different understandings and expectations of what communication is going to look like. A communication challenge can take a lot of different forms, just like the power structure that we just talked about. Your client may be contacting you way too much, or may have expectations that you're always available to speak with them. Or you may be working with a client who is really difficult to reach and who you can't get in contact with at times that it's really important that you're able to speak with them. So remember that it's important to remain flexible. One big key thing that we encourage all of our pro bono attorneys to do is to come up with a communication plan early and continue to revisit it throughout the representation. Some examples of what you want to talk about when coming up with a communication plan is talking about how frequently you're going to touch base. Are you going to talk every week, every 2 weeks? What's the best time to talk? If you keep certain hours, or if there's a time of day that's best to contact you, or if there's times that you're offline, talk to the client about those hours, and vice versa. Find out from the client when they're most likely to be available, what their work hours are, when they're most reachable, and talk about the best ways to communicate. Are you going to communicate over email, phone? Does the client prefer WhatsApp? It's also important early on in the relationship to talk about multiple methods for communication. So you want to make sure that if your client loses their phone or loses their internet access, or something happens where suddenly your plan no longer is workable, that you're still able to find them and talk to them. So are there family members? Do they have a friend that you can contact in case of emergency? How many different methods of communication are available, so that you always have a way to contact your client if and when you need to. You also may experience some issues with expectation management. Again, this might take different forms. It may be a matter of your client expecting things from you that aren't possible, or you having expectations of your client that they really can't live up to. Remember that particularly in the context of Afghan parolees, many of these clients are working with a lot of different people in a lot of different capacities. Your client may have a case manager at the refugee agency that they're working with who's helping them find a job or secure safe housing, or get their kids enrolled in school. They may even have other immigration attorneys or other attorneys that they're working with on other aspects of their legal case, or just other legal issues that they've encountered. So it's really important to be clear about how you fit into the client's broader case and what you're there to help them with, and be clear about your expectations from them as well, what you need them to do to help them be successful in their case. Next slide. So again, just a deeper look at some more practical tips to help really reach into these deeper issues around the development of trust, around breaking down that power structure, and around making sure that the client, continues to feel respected throughout the relationship. So these are just some ideas of things to bring into your practice to help ensure that you're best situated to represent the client in their case. One really easy tip that I think a lot of us lawyers forget to do is thinking about the non-legal aspects of the structure of a meeting ahead of time, and making sure that the client is playing a role in some of these decisions, particularly decisions around the meeting itself. You'll see on this slide, it talks about the where, when, and how a meeting is scheduled. And including the client in those scheduling decisions can be a really easy way to make it clear that you're a team and that their input matters. I think oftentimes we have a temptation to let the client know what time works best for us or when we're free. And sometimes because of that power dynamics, the client may agree to it, even if it's a time that maybe isn't great for them. For example, maybe the client works an overnight shift, and so a meeting at 11 a.m. they can make it to, but they're going to be coming in without any sleep, and it's probably not going to be a productive meeting. Or there might be a train scheduled. If it's an in-person meeting, the client may rely on a train to get to your office. And if it's set at a time that doesn't work with the train schedule, we might be setting our clients up to fail. They might end up being late by no fault of their own. So really understanding a client's situation and their specific needs can put the client in the best position to show up to the meeting on time and ready to go, which is a great starting point for a productive meeting. Also remember that not every meeting needs to look the same, depending on what you're covering. If it's a meeting where you are planning to get into the nitty-gritty of some more of the traumatizing details of the client's story, maybe it's a good time to reassess how many team members are going to be in on that call or who's going to be present. It's also worth considering other potential triggers that might come up. If you're doing a Zoom meeting and there's personal things in the background, or the client can hear or see your family member or even your pet. If you're in person and you have files out on your desk, or colleagues who are walking by the window or the door, or there's a meeting taking place right next door that you can hear into, those are all things that might make the client feel a little bit less safe and a little bit less protected. It might make it harder for them to open up to you. So again, just being aware of your surroundings, being aware of the client's perspective and all of these things can really help you set up for the most productive meetings possible. And then, of course, explaining attorney-client privilege early on and continuing to make sure the client understands how confidentiality is going to work throughout the course of your relationship, making sure that the client understands your role as their attorney, but also how you're helping them on their legal case specifically and the parts of their case that you're working on. Remember to continue to explain the ways in which you can't help the client. And it's always a good idea, particularly when you're getting into details of trauma, when you're getting into the specifics of their case, explain why you're asking certain questions so the client understands the context of why they need to provide you with that information, and doesn't just think maybe you're being a little nosy or asking them personal questions that they're not quite ready to share. Next slide. Offering options in the physical or virtual space, breaks and other forms of control, and space for questions is, again, just another way to make sure that the client has some sense of power and control in these meetings. It's really important that the client feel safe if they're going to be opening up to you and learning how to trust you. And really simple things like if you're doing a in-person meeting, allowing the client to pick which chair they sit in. Making sure the client knows that they can ask for a break at any time. If you're in a virtual meeting, it may be appropriate to let the client go camera off if they are having a really hard time telling you something with the camera on, and continuing to seek out different approaches to, again, make sure that the client has some sense of control over what's happening. And if you use these tips and continue to attend other trainings on these important topics and seek out resources on bringing cultural humility and awareness to your practice, then you can certainly expect that the client will get more comfortable with you and that you'll learn a lot more about their case, and they'll open up a lot more to you as the representation moves forward. Next slide. Okay, so I did mention that we wanted to spend a couple minutes just talking about tips for working with interpreters. This is important both because many of you likely will be working with interpreters, and also because working well with an interpreter and being thoughtful about who interprets for your client, again, can help with some potential communication issues that may arise. A couple of just very quick pointers. It's really important that both the client and the interpreter understand what the interpreter is there for. They are there for the purpose of facilitating communication between you and your client. They're almost an invisible force in the space when it's done really, really well, where you're talking directly to the client's talking directly to you, and the interpreter is just there to make sure that you hear each other and understand each other. And the more the interpreter knows that, and the more the client understands that, that's what they're there to do, the smoother it'll be. One really important tip is if you do have a form you're planning to fill out, or even an agenda or a loose idea of what you're going to cover during a meeting, if you're able to send it to the interpreter ahead of time, particularly if there's somebody that you're going to be using more than once, it's a good idea to do so, because then if there's some legal words that maybe they need to look up, or they want to refresh their own vocabulary for some words that maybe they don't use regularly, they can do some research and they can come to the meeting as prepared as possible to move forward. Next slide. I already mentioned this, but speaking to the client directly, if you're in person, that means looking at them, speaking to them, saying their name and you, and not he or she or they. If you're via Zoom, same thing as best you can. Speaking in short segments and making sure to pause to allow the interpreter to interpret, and checking in every once in a while with the interpreter to make sure that it's going well and that they are comfortable with the pace that you're speaking at. Again, if that's a conversation you can have beforehand, it's always helpful to say to the interpreter, let me know if you have any preferences, but otherwise just remembering to gauge how that's going so you can make adjustments to how you're speaking is helpful. It's really important to avoid side conversations. The temptation, I think, is often for the interpreter to kind of have an entire conversation with the client to clarify what the question is, clarify what their story is, and then kind of summarize what they learned back to you. And that's exactly what you don't want to do in these interactions. Well, sometimes it might be necessary for a quick little back and forth to make sure that everyone's using the right word, but you should not have the interpreter doing that summarizing thing. You really, again, want them there just to facilitate the conversation. So make sure to avoid those side conversations during the meeting itself. And then if possible, if you're working with an interpreter that you have this type of relationship with, debriefing with them after the client meeting, how did it go? What can I do better next time? Or even talking to the client after, whether they felt comfortable with that interpreter, whether they had any concerns. Of course, you'll need another interpreter to do that, but maybe there's somebody on your team who speaks the language, or maybe your client has some basic English and are able to answer some of those questions with you. Next slide. Great. So before I turn it over to Rahatoula to go into more of the Afghan specific considerations, we did think it would be helpful to just do a 2-minute overview, reminder, refresher on Afghan parolees and who they are. Next slide. So as a reminder, parole is a way for people to enter the United States in an emergency situation where they would not otherwise be able to do so. Parole status allows individuals to remain in the US for a temporary period of time, but it on its own is not a pathway to lawful permanent residence. So Afghan parolees who are in the United States are here on a temporary basis and do not, in and of themselves as parolees, have an automatic pathway to permanency here in the US. Next slide. This is really important because parolees are not refugees. For many of us who work with these types of populations, you know, we're used to refugees who enter the US in a recognized immigration status, who are immediately eligible to work on the basis of being refugees and are already on their pathway to their green cards. Again, parolees enter under this temporary status. They need a valid work authorization card to be legally allowed to work, and do not automatically or immediately get that card. And they're not allowed to remain in the US permanently and have to seek another type of immigration benefit. Next slide. One quick note though about Afghan parolees is that unlike other parolees, this particular population is being given access to other benefits that, again, are not typically available to other categories of parolees, humanitarian parolees in the United States. This includes 90 days of reception and placement, RNP services under our refugee admissions program in the United States. So Afghan parolees who are being served by resettlement agencies are getting things like airport pickup, help finding housing, and furnishing, assistance getting their social security cards, assistance enrolling in school, some employment services, some English as a second language courses, but they are not getting automatically any access to legal services. And part of what they're receiving does not include an attorney to help them find a legal pathway to permanent status in the US. So again, just as a little bit of context before I turn it over to Rahatoula, Afghan parolees, while they are getting some benefits, it's mostly on the social services side, and they do need help connecting with attorneys to obtain that lawful permanent status. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rahatullah.
Thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Could I have the next slide? Yes, thank you for joining us today. Before I go briefly over some special considerations for Afghan clients, I will be talking about the ethnicity, the religion, and the culture of Afghanistan, and most importantly, clearing up some misconceptions about the Afghan parolees, so you could better connect with your clients and understand them on a deeper level. So let's begin. Next slide. So you have to keep in mind that not all Afghan parolees are from Kabul or other urban areas. There is a vast difference between how they live their lives in these urban and rural areas. I will be addressing later on. They're not all interpreters. They didn't all work with the U.S. government or any other private military organization or nonprofit foreign organization. Not all of them speak English. Some speak different languages like Dari, Pashto, and they even speak local languages. They're not all eligible for SIV. So all of your clients will come from different backgrounds and they all have unique stories to share. And you cannot put them all in one basket. So it's important to keep that in mind. Next slide. Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic and tribal country, meaning you have a vast number of different ethnic groups that have their own customs, their own traditions, their own areas, and their own languages that they speak. But all the citizens of Afghanistan are called Afghan. They are sometimes confused with the word Afghani, which is the word for the currency. But the correct term is Afghan. That's what the national citizens of Afghanistan are called. So these ethnic groups are Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, Iraq, Turkmen, Baluch, Pashai, Nuristani, Gujar, Arab, Brohui, Qizilbash, Pamiri, Kyrgyz, Sadat. Now, out of the 40 million population, 42% are Pashtun, which is the largest group. Tajiks are the second largest group, which represent 27%. And then you have Hazaras and Uzbeks, which represent the other 9%. They are a minority group, and the others are even smaller in numbers. The national languages are Pashto and Dari, which I'm sure you heard of. Pashto is spoken by Pashtuns, while Dari is spoken by Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks. Now, a mixture of these languages is spoken by the group. There is a mismatch. Some people speak both. Some people only speak one specific language. There are other local languages, such as Uzbeki, Arabic, Pashai, and Turkic. Pashai is spoken by the ethnic group Pashai, Nuristanis, and like I said, there's always a mismatch. You'll find people speaking all three, or you will find someone speaking one local language. We had a case where an affiliate office had faced a family that only spoke Pashai, which is a local language. So they had to use two interpreters to translate their messages or to relay their information. Next slide, please. The official religion of Afghanistan is Islam. Out of the 40 million, the 99.7% are Muslims. While I believe this number is changed now, there did used to be Jews, Christians, and Sikhs in Afghanistan. Sikhism is a religion practiced by Punjabi people. It's a religion from Hinduism from India. But due to decades of war, violence, they were driven out. There used to be a large population. There are 5 branches of Islam in the whole world. 2 of those branches are present in Afghanistan. 90% are Sunni, which is the largest branch in the whole world. And the 10% are Shia, which is the second largest branch in the whole world. So what is the key difference? If you want to understand, you'll have to go back in time when the last prophet, the Islamic prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, passed away, the two groups argued who would be the successor. So the Sunni said he did not pick a successor. So his companions held an event and they picked his closest companion, Abu Bakr Siddiq, as a successor. While the Shia said, no, he did in fact pick a successor. And it is his son-in-law and cousin, Ali ibn Abu Talib. That's how the branches were made. Besides the key difference, they also have different practices that they do as in doctrine. Sunnis pray 5 times a day, while Shias can combine their prayers up to 3 times. Shias use a tablet where when they're praying, when they bow down, so it touches their forehead. Their timings differ of prayer. They also have different rituals. Shias have a ritual on the first day of Muharram, which is the first day of the Islamic calendar. So regardless of these differences in the practice, both groups, I would say every branch is sensitive about the religion, whether it's within the religion or outside. It could be Shia or Sunni saying anything to each other, they're very sensitive about it, or it's someone that is non-Muslim. So there's a high level of sensitivity because religion is heavily practiced by everyone in Afghanistan. It's one of the most important thing for them. Next slide. So the culture and gender. Interactions may be gender oriented and you may see traditional gender roles at play. Well, I will say before I start talking about this, that this does not apply for everyone, not the entire population, but in Afghanistan, when a woman was married to her husband, she would move to the husband's house. She would play the traditional role of taking care of the children, taking care of the family, and the parents of the husband, while the man would go and work while taking the lead role. Although this had changed many times over the decades, the Taliban came into power a few times and women were back into playing the traditional roles. Even before the fall, women were taking jobs in the government, in politics, in every aspect. But for places that were outside of urban areas, in some parts of urban areas, traditional roles are played. And they're very sensitive about these roles. A man will take lead and a woman will let her husband take the lead. They're very happy with it. They find a pride in taking care of their families, providing for them, and talking on their behalf, because Afghani people live in a collectivistic society. Basically, whatever decisions they make, they all make it for the family together. So observe and be mindful of the dynamics. If a woman feels uncomfortable talking to a male lawyer, maybe having a woman would help on the team to talk with her. It's not because they don't want to. Think of it this way. It's not something you're used to. It wouldn't happen, especially in rural areas. I mean, when I was young, I found it, hard to talk to girls too, because I wasn't used to something like that. So it's just an adaptation that has to happen. Next slide. So you will see a difference in the societal level between the rural and urban area population. The rural area of Afghanistan had a lot of issues. They had lack of electricity, they had lack of access to facilities, and they were the mostly affected by war. While the urban area had security for the most part, they had access, they had the best education, the rural areas didn't. And the Taliban mostly controlled the rural areas. Because of the government's, their opposition with the government, that's how the Taliban were able to kind of join in there and take over. And for the most part, they didn't have the best resources. So people who were in the urban areas, they went to the best school. They had the best jobs, high-paying jobs. They had the best technology available, better security, and that's how they were able to work in, private companies with the U.S. government. And that's how more differences come in, because in urban areas, women were able to pursue education, work in many jobs, while the rural areas were mostly women who studied, but then they were married off, or they weren't able to study. And women that were able to study and get out, make a difference, they would go back once they become a doctor or any other preference, they would go back to the rural area so they could contribute to their own area because the government had lack of access and Taliban were there. And most of the time, these people were affected by war. So experiences with trauma. For as long as I remember, Afghanistan has been at war, whether it's ethnic wars or it was wars waged by other groups. People have lost a lot of loved ones. People lost families who they're still grieving to this day. And people who kept losing on people every day. Families who had most of their relatives in the army who work for the government and they were fighting with the Taliban. And some people lost 3 sons that were in the army. So you have a population that's been traumatized by decades of war. And then you had Afghanistan that fell. And the day it fell, people weren't expecting to run from Afghanistan. I don't think anyone ever thought of it. You suddenly see the country's falling and you're running for your life on a plane. You haven't picked anything. You have nothing on your hand and you're leaving. I remember when I came, I said my goodbyes. I picked everything that I love, my favorite things. I hugged everyone, but they didn't. They left everything. They're here now and they're dealing with that. And now that they're here, some people left their families behind. There's people whose fiancés that were left out and they died, whose parents are left out and they died, or brothers or sisters. So you have all of this going through someone, or the entire population, and that's a lot. So be mindful and keep that in mind so you can better understand what they're going through. Next slide. So working with Afghan asylum seekers, your client likely has no previous experience with or awareness of legal processes. If I go back again to the rural and urban areas, in rural areas, people did not rely on the government or the legal process. For the most part, they thought it was corrupt, and they solved and resolved their issues through a mediation called the jirga. Basically, they would sit down and talk things through. So they have no experience or they are not aware of the legal process. So this is something completely new to them. And again, this does not apply for everyone. There are people who were, had access to it, they went through it, but for the most part, you will see people interact with clients that have no idea. They may not understand your role, how you are helping them, and what it means to have an attorney. Maybe they think you're another person from the resettlement agency. Maybe they don't know what exactly you're doing. So it would be important for you to just clarify that to them. They may not understand what asylum is or what they need to do to apply. I can vouch for this one. When I was doing client interviews, when I would ask them, do you know what you have to do for asylum, what it is? They would say, no, I don't know what asylum is, or I don't know what I need to do. But all I know is I have to do it within a certain time frame. So you will be interacting with clients, working with clients who have no idea what the process is or have any understanding of it. But there might be people who have read about it, they go online, they read about it, they have some basic understanding. They will be curious about the process and have a lot of questions. Honestly, I would say this could apply for everyone, whether you're an Afghan or somewhere else. You will be very curious what's going on with the case, when it's going to happen, and how it's going to happen. So I'm sure you will face that here as well. Next slide. So remember to be patient and understanding. Have a trustworthy interpreter and translator. Like I said before, once we use 2 translators to convey our messages to a family. Sometimes you may need that as well. And it's very important for the client to understand exactly what you're saying. Your message should not be misinterpreted. And since there are vast languages, they're local, there's the national, it's important to have the proper translator so they understand exactly what you're saying. Work with the client to set expectations together early and often. Explain your role as the attorney, what you're here to do for them, and discuss client responsibilities and representation of the case. So these are adults. They know their stories better than everyone. They live their lives. So you will might meet a client who is a journalist that was under the threat from Taliban or, getting killed. So that's their case. Or maybe you will meet a specific ethnic group that would have been dangerous for her to live in Afghanistan. So many different cases. And so do not put them all in one basket. Do not assume they're all can be represented in one case. They all have unique stories. So be sure to discuss with them and understand them. Next slide. Adding on again, be open to answer their questions. They will have many questions, and I think answering questions is very fun. So be open to it. Continue to assess how things are going and make adjustments as needed. And if you have any questions, bring them to HIAS and the ABA Commission on Immigration office hours, which will be shared by my colleague Sarah, or to the other legal service organization that you're working with. Next slide. So some final thoughts. This training was intended to give you some context, ideas, and food for thought, and also, understanding of the Afghan population, so you could better connect with them. You could understand them on a deeper level. Even if not, it's always good to know more about a culture and people. Your client's experiences, identities cannot be summarized and defined in a training. Exactly, nobody's stories can be defined in a slideshow or a training. Everybody's stories is unique, their identity is unique. So keep that in mind. Your clients have their own experiences and interact with the world in their own way. Yes, as beautifully written here, they have unique experiences. They have done unique things in life and come from different diverse backgrounds, ethnic groups. So they understand themselves better. Thank you very much. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so great. And a bunch of questions came into the Q&A already that pertain to specific things around working with Afghan clients, around gender dynamics, around religion. And Rahmatullah, we certainly want your thoughts on this, but I think a lot of these questions we can answer a little bit more generally. And before I do that, actually, if you want to go to the next slide, I'm just going to give the CLE code real quickly, because I know people don't want to miss that. So if you are planning to apply for CLE credit, you'll need this code 507 LAW. Again, that's 507 LAW, like the word law. 507 LAW. Write that down. You'll need it to complete the form that will circulate. So again, a bunch of questions came in around how to approach questions about religion, where the person's religion may be part of their claim, as well as questions around how to navigate working with a family where maybe the woman in the relationship has the stronger claim, or maybe there's some gender dynamics that you notice and you're concerned that you're not getting all of the information you need from the husband or the male in the relationship. So very, very generally, I just want to say that, again, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to the best way to navigate those issues with each particular client. What you really want to do is continue to remind the client about the importance of what you're trying to get from them. So if you need to talk about religion, while Rahmatullah makes a really important point that people might have sensitivities around their religion, you as their lawyer who is pursuing an asylum case based on potentially persecution because of their religion need to talk about it with them. And so explaining to them why you need to talk about their religion, letting them talk to you about it a little bit on their terms and in a respectful way, asking them how they identify, asking them to talk about their religious practice, asking them to talk you through why they may be in harm's way because of their religion. And again, continuing to remind them why it's important for you to know that is one way to help navigate that a little bit. Similarly, if you're working with a family and you're noticing some gender dynamics that you think are impacting the case, talk about it and explain that it's important that you hear from every member of the family. It's important that you get time with each member of the family individually because their details, what they know, might impact their case. Emphasize why having that information is going to make their cases a lot stronger. Use some of those tips we talked about earlier to build some trust, and and see if that helps the relationship get a little bit stronger, where maybe you're in a better position to have those conversations and try out different things. And if you are working on a case with HIAS and the ABA, or you're working with another legal services organization, if you find that you're still having difficulty having some of those conversations or getting that information, those are good questions to bring to us or to other legal service organizations to navigate a little bit more and help troubleshoot and brainstorm. I also did see a question about family member using friends or family members as interpreters. Again, that's not best practice. And being honest with the family about how that person, having that person present might impact their case. Maybe asking if you can bring in a paid interpreter for just one meeting. So you have an opportunity to hear from them and ask them some questions without the friend or family member present. And again, just being forthcoming about how these various decisions and why this information is so necessary to help them with their case. And I want to pause there to see if anybody else, we have a lot of people on the panel who didn't present today. So if anybody else has anything to add to any of those thoughts, please go ahead and do so.
There's a lot of questions coming into the chat, so I think everybody's trying hard to either answer them live or answer them, in the Q&A. There's a question in the Q&A about what if there's a conflict between family members who are seeking your help as a lawyer. I think that's partly an ethical question, and you'll have to defer to your state bar rules on that. But if there's a conflict between family members who you all represent and it affects your ability to adequately and effectively represent them, then you're going to have to look at whether you have to withdraw from representing all of them. So I think that's, looking at whether there's conflicts between family members, I think you want to look at how it affects the case and what your state bar rules are. I think that there's already a lot of people had this question about working with husbands and wives together and the gender dynamics that I think that Rahatullah is working hard to answer in the Q&A box. So I would say, take a look into the answered questions in the Q&A and see if your question is answered there.
Thanks, Rachel. I would just add to that piece too, that remember that if you are working with family members, they're signing a joint representation agreement with you. And while I did see some questions about whether it's appropriate to have separate meetings for the husband and wife, yes, I would say that if that's a way to make sure that you're getting information from the wife, if she is hesitant to speak, if the whole family is in a meeting together, but make sure that if it's a joint representation agreement, the wife understands that that the confidentiality applies to the full family. And so she can't necessarily tell you things that she doesn't want her husband to know, but she can talk to you about, the facts of her own case. And again, if this is something that comes up where there ends up being issues where their claims shouldn't be filed together, or there's something like that happening, that's something to bring to a senior attorney at your organization or a legal service organization that's mentoring you on the case to figure out the best way to move forward. And we do have a few more minutes. I know that we're dropping links to upcoming trainings in the chat. If you want to go to the next slide. As a reminder, we do have a number of resources already available, including our various toolkits. We've already done a recorded training on Asylum 101 for Afghan clients. I think I just saw out of the corner of my eye a question in the Q&A about whether or not previous interactions with the Taliban might impact the client's case. So if that's a question you have, I would encourage you to come to our future webinars where we'll be talking about bars to asylum and common issues that arise in cases for Afghan asylum seekers. That's on Friday, March 4th from 1:30 to 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then we're also doing a training on preparing for the asylum interview on Tuesday, March 15th. And again, I think those links are available in the chat. And I'm just looking at the questions. You know, again, if you're working with a client and you find that issues are arising, if you are working with a client who's a different gender from you, and you're realizing that maybe the client has a hard time making eye contact, or has difficult time telling you certain things, or if you're working with a family and you're noticing these things, again, there's not going to be a single pathway to solving that problem. The best thing to do is to sort of look back over these tips, look for other resources, bring these questions to other working groups that you're in to hear ideas that other people have turned to. But remember that these are issues that may come up. So identifying it as the issue you need to solve will go a long way to helping figure out what you need to do to move forward in the case. I know the panelists are all answering questions in the chat. Are there any other questions we should engage with live? Rahatoula, do you have any thoughts on anything else that we've covered, or any final words of wisdom and advice to folks who are going to go off and represent these clients?
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was answering questions, but yes, as I mentioned, most importantly, I would like to say it again. Each one of your clients is unique, and maybe I didn't cover everything. I might have missed something. So it's important to connect with your clients, talk to them, and you will get a better, deeper understanding of them. So we can't fit everything into one basket, as I mentioned multiple times, but thank you.
And remind your client that you're their attorney. You're trying to help them get their asylum case. And a lot of the information you need, or the way you need to work with them, is because you want to put them in the best situation possible for them to win their asylum case or their other legal case that they're working on, and be able to remain in the United States. And you're not doing it to make them uncomfortable. You're not doing it to put them in a weird situation or to be nosy. All of these things that you're asking of them is because you want to help them be in the best situation possible to win their case. I think we're at just about the end of the hour. So while the team continues to answer questions, I just want to make a note that we will be sending an email following today's training with a copy of the PowerPoint, links to register for the upcoming trainings, as well as CLE form and information. So keep an eye out for that. You should get all the resources you need to follow up via that follow-up email.